Right now, in Kumamoto Prefecture, Japan, rescue crews are still pulling people from the wreckage of a collapsed shopping mall. Right now, roughly 300,000 residents are sitting in evacuation shelters, unable to go home, unsure when they'll be allowed back. Right now, 2 nuclear power plants are being rechecked for the second time in 20 hours. And right now, seismologists across the country are staring at a live updating map of aftershocks, trying to answer one single question that nobody can honestly answer yet. Is the worst already over, or has it not happened yet? Japan's earthquake intensity scale has 10 steps. It stops at level 7. There is no level 8. The instruments simply don't need a higher number because nothing worse has ever needed to be measured on Japanese soil. Yesterday afternoon, at 4:27 p.m. local time on Tuesday, July 28th, 2 towns south of Kumamoto City, Uki and Hikawa, hit that ceiling at the exact same moment. Not close to it, not near it, at it, the maximum the scale allows. By Wednesday morning, Japan's Prime Minister was standing in front of cameras confirming at least 13 people dead, with search crews still working through a collapsed structure as she spoke. Over the next 10 minutes, here's exactly what happened over the last 20 hours, why the numbers behind this earthquake matter more than they look like they should, and why officials are telling residents that the next 7 days could matter just as much as the earthquake itself already has. The quake struck at a depth of roughly 10 kilometers, about 6 miles down. That's remarkably shallow for an earthquake of this size, and shallow depth is not a minor technical detail. It's the reason this earthquake did the damage it did. When a rupture happens that close to the surface, the energy has almost no distance to weaken before it reaches homes, hospitals, and rail lines sitting directly above it. This also wasn't an offshore event, which is the pattern people usually picture when they hear Japan earthquake. It tore through the crust directly beneath a densely populated corridor on the island of Kyushu, just south of Kumamoto City itself, meaning the towns that got hit hardest weren't far from the fault. They were sitting right on top of it. The numbers themselves come with a small but important twist. The USGS, working from global seismic networks and standard moment magnitude calculations, placed the epicenter roughly 5 kilometers east of Uto City and settled on a magnitude of 6.8. Japan's own meteorological agency, sitting on the densest seismic monitoring network on the planet, with sensors planted directly on top of the rupture zone, measured it independently at 7.1 on its own domestic scale. 2 respected agencies, 2 slightly different numbers, describing the exact same physical event using different calculation methods. And here's the part that actually matters. Neither of those numbers is really the headline. The headline is what instruments on the ground directly recorded. Maximum intensity 7 in Uki and Hikawa, full stop. That number doesn't get revised later the way magnitude estimates sometimes do. It's simply what happened. The single most serious individual incident from this earthquake is still unfolding at Aeon Mall in Kumamoto. An explosion, officials suspect a gas leak, though the cause hasn't been formally confirmed, tore through the building shortly after the quake, and part of the second floor came down. Rescue crews worked through the entire night pulling people from the wreckage. By early Wednesday, prefectural officials confirmed 8 people had been brought out. 2 women in their 20s were confirmed dead. A third person was reported in cardiopulmonary arrest. The remaining 5 were injured, though officials said their conditions were not considered life-threatening. Given the timing, shortly before evening rush hour, when the mall would have been close to peak foot traffic, this single site may end up defining a significant share of this disaster's final human toll. Across the wider region, the damage picture kept filling in through the night. Multiple building collapses and fires were reported in Yatsushiro City. A bridge in the affected area partially collapsed. Kumamoto Castle, a national landmark still under restoration from the last time this exact fault system hit it, back in 2016, sustained new damage to its stone walls. Hospitals are under real strain. One major regional facility with 400 beds reported being at full capacity, forced to suspend scheduled admissions, even as patients injured by falling furniture kept arriving one after another. Roughly 300,000 residents are now under evacuation guidance across the region. Tens of thousands of households lost power, and the regional utility has directly warned people not to touch any downed lines. Rail operator JR Kyushu suspended service across its entire network, including the Kyushu Shinkansen bullet train line. The regional airport closed its runway pending inspection. Japan's self-defense forces have been formally activated under a disaster dispatch request, mobilizing coordinated ground, maritime, and air resources. And the Prime Minister stood up a national task force within an hour of the quake. None of this is overreaction. High-speed rail literally cannot resume running until every kilometer of track, every viaduct, and every tunnel portal has been physically inspected. Because a bullet train encountering a displaced rail joint at close to 300 kilometers an hour would be its own catastrophe stacked directly on top of this one. Here's the part almost nobody explains properly, and it's the single most common mistake in earthquake reporting. Magnitude and intensity are not the same thing. Magnitude measures the total energy released by the fault itself, one number describing the whole earthquake, no matter where you're standing when it happens. Intensity measures how violently the ground actually moved at one specific location, and that number changes depending on exactly where you are standing relative to the rupture. A quake in the high 6s or low 7s magnitude-wise is nowhere near the largest earthquake Japan has ever recorded in absolute terms. But a shallow rupture directly beneath a populated area delivers its energy essentially point blank, which is exactly how this event produced the maximum possible intensity reading despite a magnitude that on paper doesn't sound catastrophic. Now here's the part that makes those numbers genuinely visceral instead of just abstract. The magnitude scale is logarithmic, not linear. Every single full step up the scale doesn't mean somewhat more energy. It means roughly 32 times more energy released. So the numerical gap between a smaller magnitude 6 earthquake and yesterday's magnitude 6.8 to 7.1 event isn't small, it's enormous. To put that in physical terms people can actually feel, a magnitude 7 earthquake releases energy in the range of over 30 million tons of TNT equivalent, more than 1,000 times the yield of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. That is not an exaggeration added for dramatic effect. That is the literal physics of what 1 point higher on the scale actually means in terms of released energy. And this is exactly why a smaller magnitude 6 aftershock, landing on top of a region already cracked open by a magnitude 6.8 to 7.1 main shock, remains genuinely dangerous. A second earthquake doesn't need to match the first one in size to cause serious damage. It only needs to be strong enough to finish what the first one already started, hitting cracked walls, already strained retaining structures, and slopes primed to fail, all of which were fine 24 hours ago and are not fine now. This is where Kumamoto's own history becomes, quite literally, the operating manual behind every emergency decision being made in this region right now. 10 years ago, in April 2016, this exact same region was struck by a magnitude 6.5 earthquake that also registered maximum intensity 7. At the time, seismologists treated it as the main shock. Residents were told the worst had passed, and people who had evacuated began returning to their damaged homes. 28 hours later, a magnitude 7.3 earthquake ruptured the connected Futagawa Fault, larger than the first quake, and also registering intensity 7. The event everyone had initially called the main shock was reclassified afterward as a foreshock. It hadn't been the disaster, it had been the warning. Roughly 275 people died across that combined sequence, many of them in buildings that had already been weakened by the first shock and then came down entirely in the second. Kumamoto Castle itself lost walls and roof tiles in the first event and suffered far worse damage in the second. Search crews working rubble piles during that 2016 sequence were pulled off active rescues by the arrival of the stronger second quake. Same fault system, same region, same maximum intensity reading both times. But the actual outcome depended entirely on what happened in the following 28 hours, and that's precisely why Japan's meteorological agency formally rewrote its national public guidance after 2016. The agency could no longer simply reassure people that aftershocks would only ever get smaller over time. The current standing guidance, born directly from this prefecture's own experience, is that for roughly a week following a large inland earthquake, a quake of comparable size can still follow. That is the exact language Japan's prime minister used publicly this week, urging residents to remain vigilant for the possibility of another earthquake of similar scale. When you hear that specific warning, understand it isn't generic caution. It's this exact fault system's own documented track record, now written directly into national emergency policy and pointed back at the same ground that created it. Seismologists lean on two well-established statistical patterns here. Bott's law, drawn from thousands of recorded sequences worldwide, holds that the largest aftershock typically lands somewhere between 1.1 and 1.2 magnitude units below the main shock. Applied to this event, that puts the statistically expected largest aftershock somewhere in the range of magnitude 5.6 to 6.0. That is not a forecast promising it will happen, but after what happened in 2016, nobody in Japan is treating it as a hard ceiling either. Omori's law describes the second pattern, how aftershock frequency decays over time, rapid at first, then gradually thinning out across days and weeks. A sequence fading roughly on that expected schedule is a sequence behaving normally normally. A sequence that stalls, suddenly surges, or produces events that stop getting smaller is exactly the pattern that earns close attention, because 2016 taught this specific prefecture that the difference between an aftershock and a genuine foreshock only ever becomes clear in hindsight. As with any major disaster, false claims started spreading within the first hour, worth addressing directly because correcting them actually sharpens what's genuinely true about this event. Claim 1. This earthquake marks the beginning of Japan's long-feared Nankai Trough megaquake scenario. False. The Nankai Trough is a separate offshore subduction zone entirely, the source region behind Japan's long-term magnitude 8 and 9 earthquake scenarios. This rupture happened inland, within the shallow crust of central Kyushu, on a structurally separate fault system. No agency has linked the two events, and Japan has a specific formal mechanism, a Nankai Trough advisory, that gets issued when an earthquake genuinely does touch that system, as happened after a magnitude 7.1 quake struck offshore in August 2024. No such advisory has been issued this time, and that absence is itself one of the clearest available signals of what this earthquake is and isn't. Claim 2. Viral footage showing Kumamoto Castle's stonework collapsing this week. Also false. That footage is from the actual 2016 disaster, recirculating online as though it were filmed now. Since the castle's restoration has continued for a decade, old and new damage can genuinely look similar on camera, worth treating any specific viral clip with caution until officially confirmed. Claim 3. This earthquake signals an imminent eruption at nearby Mount Aso. There's no evidence supporting that. A tectonic earthquake by itself does not indicate rising magma, and none of the actual warning signs, sustained volcanic tremor, rapid ground deformation, or an official alert level change, have been reported by any monitoring agency. Japan has only recorded a maximum intensity 7 reading 8 times in its entire instrumented history: Kobe in 1995, Niigata in 2004, the Tohoku megaquake in 2011, Kumamoto itself twice in 2016, Hokkaido in 2018, the Noto Peninsula in 2024, and now this. 3 of those 8 readings, out of the country's entire modern seismic record, have now come out of this single prefecture alone. The earthquake itself isn't the only reason officials are being this careful right now. It's what happened 28 hours after the main shock a decade ago on this exact same ground. Kumamoto learned that lesson at a cost of roughly 275 lives. Nobody there is willing to make that same assumption twice. Have you ever felt an earthquake yourself? Even a small one? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to hear it. If this video helped you actually understand what's happening in Japan right now instead of just the headlines, hit like and let's get this one to 5,000 likes. And if you want to keep following this story as the aftershock sequence develops, subscribe to Infinity Alert. We'll be back the moment the picture changes.